Hello, I'm Chris Hartwell, and welcome to the Heartbeat. Today we're going to be talking about episode 3 of season 1 of HBO's Westworld. Join me, won't you? So, Westworld seems very interested in the slow and plotted growth and evolution of its characters as they move closer and closer to a place of chaos and likely revolution. But even on this week's episode, as we witnessed numerous very safe, repetitive, closed-loop storylines, from the ever-recurring player piano to the group of cowboys unable to progress due to the absence of the one host in their party able to wield an axe, there were a few other loops, though, experienced by both androids and humans that with each subsequent cycle did show themselves to be slowly expanding and evolving. And of course, the most noteworthy of those would be Dolores' loop. Starting last week, we began to see this slowly advancing storyline involving that pistol. At one time, just moved toward in the night, then unearthed, then stored in a drawer, and finally, used. And watching Dolores fight her programming was one of the more intriguing elements of this episode. Like those ranchers who couldn't even touch an axe, or Teddy who just couldn't bring himself to commit to a departure date more specific than someday, Dolores just couldn't squeeze the trigger on that gun. Her programming wouldn't allow it. But given that she had very clearly been provided the building blocks that Ford's presumably dead partner Arnold was so convinced would lead to consciousness, those being memories, improvisation, self-interest, and finally the bicameral mind, which was very clearly coming from Bernard in this instance, who previously seemed content to merely whisper, "Remember, remember," but this week pressed further saying, "Kill him," it really didn't come as much of a surprise when she finally disobeyed her programming and committed that murder. Which leads me to Bernard, who's presently probably my favorite character on the show. Of all of them, I just have the clearest idea of who that man is and what he wants, while at the same time still left to wonder where exactly all of that will lead him. And once again, with Bernard's secret meetings with Dolores, we saw another loop of sorts, which by the episode's end was certainly poised to change dramatically. Bernard is now ready to release Dolores and let her swim. In those meetings, though there was nothing particularly subtle or original about the Alice in Wonderland references, a piece of literature that is played with all the time on sci-fi shows and films, it did effectively show us that Bernard was bringing that book to Dolores because, more than anything, he was still a grieving father who was desperate to project onto that relationship the kind of connection that he'd never again experience with his son. Continually told Dolores to remember things because he himself couldn't forget or let go of the painful memories associated with his lost child. What I really love about Bernard's interactions with Dolores, though, as it was just so telling as to who he was as a character, was any time that he was confused by her or needed a concrete answer from her, he would simply command her to step into analysis. For a man who is robbed of his son, something over which any parent would eternally scream to the heavens, "Why?" And also an employee forced to contend with a cryptic boss like Ford, who constantly forced him to report to people like Teresa, "I can't tell you what I don't know," it just made complete sense that he would revel in a relationship that was so black and white. And seeing that comfort that Bernard took from being able to know Dolores' mind earlier on in the episode really did make the moment when she finally responded to an inquiry, "I don't know," pack a punch. Because on one hand, it was frustrating and terrifying for him to realize that his own creation could no longer robotically spit out a binary answer. But at the same time, that it wasn't just zeros and ones, so to speak, was so incredibly thrilling because it's so incredibly human not to know exactly why we say what we say and why we feel what we feel. And speaking of mysterious responses, I was rather surprised by Ford's actions this week. Previous to this episode, really seeing him as this creator who couldn't wait to make the next quantum leap in robotics and indeed human evolution. To me, his were the hands that just couldn't wait to leave those piano keys in the opening credits sequence, allowing that player piano to do its own thing. So it really did feel apt in that one scene that he settled right in front of that wall of faces, because I was definitely thinking, who is this guy? Which of his quote-unquote faces is truly representative of him? Is he actually satisfied with someone like Teddy only acting as the stalwart gunslinger against which guests can face off if they want to have their way with Dolores? Is he really this calloused boss who forces his employees to objectify the hosts? Or is he acting this way because the still mysterious board is breathing down his neck and he's simply trying to throw them off his scent? I still do wonder, is the reason that he tasked Teddy to go and hunt down Wyatt to keep him away from Dolores, or to finally allow him to deal with his dark past and join her in freedom? Does he want Teddy to snuff out Wyatt because he could hear the voice of God? Or does he want Teddy to learn from him? Personally, I would find it much more interesting to discover that all this behavior was part of a long, elaborate scheme, and that perhaps even it wasn't Arnold at all that was interested in creating consciousness, but Ford himself. It just doesn't seem like a coincidence at all that Ford explained that the only holdover from his late partner's designs were the voice commands used to control the robots. Voice commands that we've seen fail numerous times, but still haven't been updated. Last week with Maeve coming to during her maintenance, and again this week with our Constellation carving android coming to, so that he could destroy his own head. The very thing that perhaps would have allowed his creators to put an end to the evolution that's occurring in him, as well as in his fellow androids. And while on the subject of Arnold, there did seem to be some striking similarities between he and Bernard. I mean, Ford's description of the former could have very easily applied to the latter when he said, in his alienation, he saw something in the hosts. And obviously, we would be hardly remiss if we didn't at least address the elephant in the room. Of course, I'm referring to the speculation that with Westworld, we're actually watching two distinct timelines, separated by 30-odd years, which are allowing us not only to see William when he first arrived to Westworld, but also 30 years later, having grown from the cowboy that chose the white hat into the man in black. And though I still don't wholly subscribe to this theory, it's definitely grown on me, and there certainly are a number of indicators that something fishy is going on. First off, the showrunner of this show is Jonathan Loves to Mess with Time Nolan. I mean, the guy penned Memento, The Prestige, and Interstellar, and in case you haven't seen any or all those movies, I won't spoil them, but let's just say each film really does love to play with time, just in how those stories are ordered and structured. But looking at the show itself, there was an incident that occurred 30 years ago, which does seem like a very logical place to build a past storyline to, if in fact there is a past storyline. But also in the pilot episode, we were shown the lower levels of Delos, which were in a state of disrepair and presumably hadn't been used for 30 years. A location that looks suspiciously similar to the shiny and new station that William and Logan arrived at in episode 2. Furthermore, the cutting between William and the Men in Black over the last couple of episodes really did seem like it was trying to illustrate a connection between the pair. Specifically, this week we had the Men in Black tell Dolores, "Why don't we reacquaint ourselves, Dolores? Start at the beginning." And then, moments later, we cut to William, framed in a very similar way. And on top of that, last week we saw the identical romantic moment that occurred between Teddy and Dolores occur between William and Dolores, which really does make me think, and go with me here for a moment, what if back in the 70s Dolores ultimately fell in love with William, and that became, as Elsie described the stray's relationship to his woodwork, her anchor and her cornerstone, the thing that held her where she was supposed to be. And so when that thing came undone during that first incident, to maintain a semblance of it, the creators gave her Teddy. Other ways that the writers seem to be teeing us up for this big reveal, though, were these small, inexplicable moments, like the gun disappearing in Dolores' drawer, which I definitely think could have simply been us cutting from the present-day timeline to the 30 years ago timeline. In a similar way, the closing moments of the episode as Dolores fled her farmhouse seemed to connect both storylines. As she sprinted out of the barn, Dolores seemed to be struck by a memory of previously being shot by one of the bandits, which allowed her in that instance to avoid being shot, which tells me that the Dolores who stumbles out of the darkness and collapses into William's arms could have been running from any number of dangerous experiences, not just the one we saw play out at the farmhouse. And honestly, guys, the more that I think about this theory, the more excited I am, and the more I hope it is true. And not just because it would be a cool twist, but also because I think it plays directly into the themes of this show, and just the cyclical nature of things throughout history, and some of the mistakes that we've made in the past being repeated in very horrible ways again in the future, and the sins of the father being passed on to his sons. Those are my thoughts anyways on this week's episode of Westworld. Before I close things out though, I must give a very special shout out to a new patron of mine over on patreon.com. June, welcome aboard. Thank you so much for pledging your hard-earned dollars to this channel. Specifically, because of your and my other patrons' contributions, I'm going to be able to get out just a few weeks earlier my Fellowship of the Ring review. And that makes me so very excited and humbled and thankful, so thank you, June. Thank you. And to the rest of you guys, even if you can't pledge your money on patreon.com, please do subscribe. I'm going to continue to review films and television on this channel, and I would love for you to stay up to date on all of those things. But for now, I'm Chris Hartwell. This is The Heartbeat. Thank you for joining me.